joining us this afternoon. My assumption is that you've been following developments in Israel and Palestine. It's particularly tragic. How much of what we're watching today may be slightly religious or maybe in context political?
It's an interesting question, and I think we should focus on political. This is a political conflict. It's a conflict that in many respects is familiar to us over resources, over land, over rights, over who gets control of different spaces. It is a very long-standing conflict. It is also not unusual in that the conflict can be traced back to the colonial history of, in this instance, British rule in that part of the world. What you have had is a state of Israel, which has now been around since 1948. So we're now 75 years plus. And you have had the Palestinians as a stateless people, living, many of them, as refugees since then. So we're now in generation 3, 4 of people living as refugees. You have Palestinians under Israeli occupation. Mm-hmm. You have Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, albeit discriminated against in important structural ways. Now, there is a religious overlay here, of course, though I'm not being dismissive of your point, because part of the impetus, motivation, narrative, and fortunately all the most dangerous parts of this conflict, a zero-sum religious approach between those on the Jewish side who feel that this is biblically promised land, and likewise those on the Palestinian Muslim side. But I don't think that characterizes the major impetus in, say, Joyce.
Well, fair, really, because it's a really, really complex situation, and the dynamic is a little hard for observers, particularly those who may not be properly informed as to the history between Arabs and Israeli. If you would, can you just take us back a little into what happened in 1948 that may really still have an influence on today's reality between Israeli and Palestine?
Yes, and I think that's very fair. And for me to be fair as well, you know this from, if I told you, give me a history of a certain dynamic in Nigeria. Yeah. Everyone is going to have their own
narrative,
way of telling this. And let me try and be as fair as possible. You have an indigenous people, the Arab people under the Turkish Ottoman Empire, under British rule, as is the case in many parts of the world in that era. As we move towards decolonization, Palestinians begin to assert a Palestinian national identity. In a similar period of time, Jews who are being persecuted and facing anti-Semitism in Europe look around and say, well, maybe we need to think of ourselves in nation terms, in national terms, not just in religious terms. And a movement is formed called Zionism. Yeah. And actually, after a debate, it decides that the only place you can really form that is in something that appeals to the historic biblical connection. So there you go. You've got a religious element coming in there.
Okay.
And now, of course, there are indigenous people there, and there's colonial power there, and there's a struggle, and the Zionists trying to the colonial powers. The Holocaust is really what gives Zionism its impetus, the tragedy of the Holocaust. It's poured among Jews. Now, the UN decides that, and the Palestinians, I felt this was an unfair decision because they were replacing, as they saw it, one colonizer with another, that the UN decides that the land should be partitioned and it should be a pretty even split. The Palestinians do not think that's fair. There is an armed conflict, relatively badly armed, not particularly militarily effective Arab states join that war. That is the 1947 to 49 war. Yeah. During that war, Israel expels, there's an act of major ethnic cleansing, which Israel expels them 75% of the Palestinians from the territory that becomes Israel. Many of them were expelled to Gaza. So when you see the pictures today of Gaza and people about refugee camps, that's where that comes from. What you're left at the end of that is that 78% of the land is under Israeli. Jordan has a bit of the Palestinian area, Egypt's Gaza, And in 1997, Israel takes over 100% of it, but the Palestinians in these areas, the West Bank and Gaza, which are two separate areas, become under Israeli occupation. So that's where we've been. Since then, there's been a peace process. It's failed, but I'll hand back to you because I'm sure you have your next question.
Well, no, I mean, I would even love for you to further your thought. I'm really, really waiting to just take a slice out of your experience, because if this has been going on for so long, I will assume that something akin to an understanding, a middle ground. And this brings us to the question of a two-state solution. So what in your experience may have been hindering or is hindering a two-state solution?
Yes, I was a negotiator on the Israeli side during the efforts to reach a two-state solution. And if I try and distill it down, rather than go into a whole load of details about places that may be less familiar to your listeners, fundamental is that Israel would have to give up land that it had put settlements on. It had moved some of its citizens into these areas. Others thought those areas had biblical importance. Others thought they would be useful militarily or for their resources. Those settlements were, of course, illegal under international law, and Israel would have to give up. Now, at a certain point in time, as you say, you begin to coalesce around, you begin to come together around something that looks like a solution. That was the 90s. But for it to happen, given the power asymmetry, given that Israel is a powerful party, it had the land, it had the military power, and the Palestinians were people without that power, for that to work out, the external actors would have had to keep the sides of this, to make sure that the powerful party had incentive to get this done, or at least had disincentives to not get done. And if you want my answer to your question, that's where it fell apart, because the Americans were the key organizing party. They almost had a monopoly over managing this issue. And rather than making sure that the Israelis made good on that commitment, as Israel slipped further and further away from allowing a real Palestinian state, the Americans indulged the Israelis. They let them get away with it. And I do think it's reasonable to draw a direct causal line from that indulgence, from allowing Israel to basically cheat and make it worse, to the situation we are in today, unfortunately. And as a negotiator, I can tell you, we would have been much better off if we'd have had America breathing down our necks.
Wow. Okay, Lagos, Nigeria, we're speaking to Daniel Levy, former Israeli negotiator. We're going to quickly observe a very short break. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. Gold diggers. Tunneling through the mishaps and the handicaps.
I don't know what to cook for them. I don't know what to give them to eat. That is the issue at hand as I speak right now.
In the name of the good, we hope to earn the truth and be worth our weight in salt.
Every night, every lad and there would hear 1 million boys, 2 million boys, 3 million boys. Common people wouldn't have no money. They're supposed to find it where people can follow you. Everybody can follow you, both the rich and those poor.
The Sunny Side with Joyce.
The Sunny Side with Joyce.
Weekdays 12 to 3 p.m. on 99.3 Cherry. Let's talk.
We're back. 99.3 Nigeria Info, the Sunny Side. Former Israeli negotiator Daniel Levy joining us from London as we are trying to comprehend, make sense of what appears to be, as has been called by many, a genocide. Now, you are Israeli, and I'm not even sure whether this is an appropriate question to ask. Israel has been characterized as an apartheid state. Would you say that there is some truth to that?
Well, I think it's very important, first of all, to share that apartheid, of course, was a living reality in a part of your continent not so long ago. Apartheid has subsequently been defined as a crime under international law. So to make the designation of apartheid means things in some way approximate South Africa, for instance, but it also is not to say there is one-to-one likeness. It is to say that there is a type of structural discrimination that controls this, that the Israeli regime is imposing, that meets that international definition. The claim was made by Palestinians. I think in the last few years, Palestinian groups and Palestinian academics, in the last few years, what has been a very significant development is that the Israeli human rights community, those who have made it their lives to apply international law to the realities there, have come to make that same designation. And then the global human rights groups, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, and this have made that designation in the last 3 years. And this isn't, okay, you know what, we've looked at it and yeah, it's apartheid. They have written long, deeply researched, and very credible documentation of how it meets this legal bar. So I do think that there is real credibility to that. I also want to say, Joyce, that one of the things we're facing today is, and this is part of what a system of apartheid in its manifestations as in a society, psychologically, attitudinally, not legally, okay? One of the things the system of apartheid also does is it dehumanizes the other, right? It means where Palestinians are treated unequally and are seen as less than. We also have to recognize that what happened on the weekend, and it was a horrendous attack against Israelis, which does not justify a second war crime, okay? But what happened would not have been possible if that dehumanization was not also happening on the other side, if Israeli Jews had not been dehumanized and Palestinianized. So yes, dehumanization on both sides, but the overall context is one of, a powerful party that is imposing an appalling regime which can be legitimately called apartheid on another party.
And I don't even mean to put you in a corner, but I must ask you this question then. And I love the fact that you're trying to properly carry both sides through. You're speaking to me and I can really hear the spirit of a negotiator come right out of you. But what I find to be rather tricky would be the characterization of Hamas. Now, Hamas is said to be a terrorist group. But then some Palestinians may not agree or do not agree with Hamas. But then there are others who say Hamas, though characterized as a terrorist group, is not a terrorist group. Hamas is a resistance. So then if you are observing the outplay of what's happening between Israel and Palestinians, you wonder whether the Palestinians even deserve a right. And if they do, then is Hamas not just in what would appear to be human nature, defending Palestinians? So is Hamas a terrorist group or resistance? Okay.
Indeed. And the way I'm going to try and respond to the tricky question, Joyce, is it's not an either or. Oh. You can be a resistance movement, and the tactics you use include terror, include violating international law. Now, let's come at it from a couple of angles, if I can. First of all, Palestinians under an illegal occupation have the right to self-defense, including armed resistance, but that has to take place within the framework of international law. So that doesn't allow you to target civilians. It doesn't allow you to do what we saw. And I don't know your political space well enough, but I imagine some of this throws up very fresh memories for people in your country.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So that's one part of it. The fact that you are a resistance movement struggling against an illegal occupation allows you certain things in international law. It does not allow you other things, and those are things that Hamas has done. Just as what Israel is doing now in Gaza, when it says it is acting in self-defense and it has been attacked, that still has to take place within the framework of international law. So no, you are not allowed to cut the supply of food, water, electricity, humanitarian supplies to a civilian population. You're not allowed to indiscriminately bomb. You can't forcibly displace people. Things have to be proportionate, etc. One other comment on Hamas. Hamas is, alongside being an armed resistance, alongside being a movement that sometimes violates international law, conducts acts that would credibly be seen as terror, is a political movement. It has stood in Palestinian elections, it won Palestinian elections. It was then deposed from power. The world refused to recognize its victory. It has had contacts, indirect, direct as well, with Israel. It has had an ongoing kind of negotiation with Israel.
Maybe then the question, pardon me for interrupting your thought, then maybe what I would really like to ask you in that regard is, did Israel help create Hamas? So further your thought and try to touch on that nerve for me.
It's very well documented
that
at the time of Hamas's creation, Israel was worried that the Palestinian secular national movement, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, the people around that, Fatah, that they were getting strong. They were getting too popular. They were becoming internationally too much of a challenge to Israel. And wouldn't it be good if this more religious movement could gain more support, and maybe that religious movement wouldn't be as political? Now, later on, Hamas became very convenient because rather than calling them a religious movement, you could focus on the fact that they were easily depicted, because of their own actions often, as a terror group. Really important thing to note here is Israel made a deal, that peace possibility that we were talking about earlier. Israel made a deal with the PLO, with Fatah, around the idea of a two-state option. Now, this is crucial to hold in your head. Fatah basically gave up armed resistance and said, we will just conduct our struggle through politics, through negotiations. And that was the chance to show people that that path works. But instead of helping Fatah deliver, helping the PLO deliver, they were undermined at every stage. And what you see, which is not to justify anything, but what you see is, and this is classic, really, when every other avenue is blocked. So the Palestinians say, can we go to the UN? No, America vetoes stuff in the UN. Can we go to the International Criminal Court? No, America puts huge, and other European countries put huge pressure on the International Criminal Court not to engage in this issue any further. Can we sanction Israel for its violations of international law? When other countries violate international law, they face a consequence, and that can sometimes make people think differently about the politics. No, we won't sanction Israel. We give Israel total impunity. When every avenue is blocked, you can pretty clearly expect that something's going to blow up, that violent resistance is going to be the path pursued to redress a huge grievance, which doesn't justify it. But you can't understand what's going on if you don't understand that very basic equation.
Yeah. And just if you can, in a few sentences, help me direct my thinking here. Israel did try, or did Israel create, or were they part of the creation of Hamas? To any degree, any extent whatsoever, support, financial, otherwise, at the initial stage?
Well, there's a lot of studies that have been done on this, and the short answer is yes. Did they fund? No. Did they turn a blind eye? Were they happy to see certain funding? Like I said, this is in the 80s. They were quite happy to see this movement come about. In more recent history, what you've seen is, again, a very classic kind of colonial play here. Israel has been very happy to encourage Palestinian division. So Fatah and the PLO are divided. There haven't been elections. One small part of the occupied territory, the West Bank, is controlled by this one Fatah PLO. Hamas controls Gaza. And Israel has tried to maintain a system whereby that division continues and Hamas and Gaza can keep its head just above water. Just enough supplies going in. Those things always go in with Israel's okay. And sometimes Israel comes and says, well, how can we negotiate with these guys? And the Palestinians are divided. But the people most interested in maintaining that division, because they're not really interested anymore, unfortunately, in a serious negotiation, is the Israeli side. And it's really interesting that some very prominent Western politicians have met with the Hamas leadership. They had articles in the New York Times, in all these. They've tried to reach out. Now, it, again, doesn't excuse anything, but it shows there are missed opportunities.
All right, so I'm going to quickly go off on a break. We'll be right back, Lagos. Don't go anywhere.
Beg to Differ Debate Championship audition has now commenced. So if you didn't know, you know now. Well, secondary school students from age of 13 to 16 can now compete for the grand prize of 1 million naira. Yes, you heard me. Only the best is crowned the winner. And registration has already started, though. If you don't know, registration has already started and it will end October 20th. And how do you register? Upload a 4-minute sound recording, 2 minutes arguing in favor, and 2 minutes arguing against. We want to hear you argue both sides so we can see how good you really are. Successful candidates will be contacted via email. So, do you think you have what it takes? I mean, do you think you're really up to the task? Well, if you do, then do not sleep on this. I repeat, do not sleep on this, Lagos. Begin your registration now. To enter for the championship, visit nigerianifo.fm to begin your registration. That is nigerianifo.fm to begin your registration. I wish you good luck.
This is an infomercial.
We're like gold diggers, tunneling through the mishaps and
More
the
news and
handicaps.
information coming up. We'll be back in a moment.
That is the issue at hand as I speak right now.
Smith Nation, in collaboration with TuneCore, presents our Sound 2023. This is a call for independent female artists, producers, and songwriters in the Nigerian music industry to register to be part of our Sound 2023. We will take lucky participants through a transformative experience that will not only give these women the opportunity.
Serenade you with soul and country music. Catch up with beautiful divas every Wednesday at the Ladies' Night. Our weekend kicks up with back in the days gyration, cross-continental vibe from different live band maestros. To battles of D-Days, high live music, jazz, reggae live band, and many more. 100% fun guaranteed at Westgate Lounge, located at Olowura City, behind Amalefesu Estate, Ikeja, Lagos. For inquiry, please call 0703-745-0669. Westgate Lounge. Catch the vibes.
Get ready for the most exciting national spelling competition of the year. The 15th edition of the Spelling Leaders Competition is coming to your neighborhood for schools in Lagos, Abuja, and Ogun States. Mark your calendars. The competition kicks off on February 2024 and you won't want to miss it. Early preparation is key. Register and get the word list to start preparing your school for the competition. Do you have what it takes to become a spelling champion? This is your chance to shine. Hurry and register your school today. To register your school and secure your spot, call or WhatsApp 0907 002 7521 or 0813 062 4789. Don't miss out on the opportunity to show your spelling prowess and win amazing prizes. It's a spellbinding experience you'll remember forever.
Brought to you by Spell Africa International, where champions are born. You before, and it's best. Hear it again. The best is crowned the winner. The I Beg to Differ Debate Championship auditions has begun. Secondary school students from the ages 13 to 16 can compete for the grand prize of 1 million naira. Registration starts October the 6th and ends October the 20th. Here's how to register. Upload a 4-minute sound recording, 2 minutes arguing in favor, and 2 minutes arguing against. We want to hear you argue both sides so we can see how well you debate. Visit nigeriainfo.fm to begin your registration.
Going on a vacation or a business trip? Catching a flight to see family or taking a break in Zanzibar? Wherever you're going and for whatever reason, Wakanao has got you covered. Enjoy unbeatable travel deals with only a 10% down payment and pay small in convenient installments. Book now on wakanao.com. Download the Wakanao app for even cheaper deals or walk into any of our travel centers near you. Wakanao. Let's go.
99.3 Nigeria Info, your #1 station for talk. Let's talk.
We're back. 99.3 Nigeria Info. It's Nigeria. We're back. Daniel Levy still with us, but he has to go. I have a final question for Daniel, which is what appears to be the now ongoing conversation of a possibility of a ground invasion. So, Dan, what can you tell us could be a horror of that if it happens?
Well, we're in the horror already. We've been in the horror for 9 days, but you are right. This can get worse, not only in Gaza, where we're seeing the mass displacement of people from one part of Gaza to another, but there is also the prospect of a wider regional war because things have heated up on the Israel border with Lebanon. Hezbollah may get involved. And others are saying that if what is happening to the Palestinians continues and gets worse, then there is really a likelihood of a regional conflagration. I hope I can be with you again, but I would say this. What is going on there is not leaving other places untouched, whether it's mass marches in Europe, whether it's huge rallies across the Arab world, but also in your part of the world, I understand that people are engaged and exercised on this. And for me, that is another reason to try to make sure that this is de-escalated and there's a ceasefire as soon as possible. And if America can't do this alone, then we have an interesting shifting world today. And I think countries from, I don't love the term, the global south, powers like Nigeria, like others on your continent, in Asia, in South America, should get engaged and be pushing for a ceasefire because it has a destabilizing effect well beyond the borders of where we are.
It has been a pleasure having you here, Daniel, really. And I look forward to having you again. Thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you. Lagos, we're off on a break. Bring you the news update. We'll be back.
99.3 Nigeria Info. We are more than just radio. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Nigeria Info FM. Check us out on Facebook at Nigeria Info 99.3. Follow us on Twitter at Nigeria Info FM and on Instagram at Nigeria Info FM Lagos for live updates as it happens. 99.3 Nigeria Info.